And we are live. Hello, everyone. I am Jessper Maquindang. And if you're here to really build a stronger team and a more effective culture, you're in the right place. In each episode, we provide strategies, tips, and insights to really help you build a business or company that thrives. And today, we have a very special guest. And as we welcome our guest, let's learn more about Greg Brisendine. Greg Brisendine is a coach and consultant who accelerates his clients' growth and career success. He leverages decades of work as a corporate leader, people manager, and metrics expert to help his clients reach their goals. Greg has published a book about key performance indicators, has spoken at numerous conferences, and in his spare time, bakes sourdough bread and is a playwright. Let's welcome Greg Brisendine. Greg, welcome to the show. How are you?
Hi, Jessper. I'm doing great. How are you today?
I'm excellent. So today I'm just very excited about today's feedback, this idea of motivational feedback. Love to learn more. Tell me more about the research in the field and what you've discovered.
I will. There's a good bit of research about feedback. And so to sort of to set the stage for it, the research I looked into and what I'm going to talk about today is the way that leaders provide information to their subordinates more often than not, verbal information. So that's the feedback we're going to focus on specifically. So there's some interesting statistics associated with feedback, and I don't think there'll be a surprise here. I'm looking at my notes over here. 96% of employees in one study I looked at say that getting regular feedback is a good thing. Probably not a surprise. 44% of the employees in this feedback said that they weren't getting enough. 48% said they were getting about the right amount. The interesting thing about the feedback that might not be intuitive in this particular study and some of the studies I looked at is that too little feedback is not great, according to employees, and too much feedback is not great, according to employees. It is possible to overdo it. And so there was a lot of discussion in the analysis that I read about what the right amount is. And from there, what I know, both from the research and then just from my own experience as a people leader for a really long time, what feedback is given also matters. And so that's I think a thing that's important to talk about as well.
Excellent. And with the research, the first one you shared with the 96% of employees that are receiving, that want feedback, I'm curious to know about the other 4%. Could it be a fear of just hearing what their boss wants to say? I'm just super curious.
I would, I didn't look into the 4%, but my guess, I've done a lot of survey work and a lot of qualitative analysis. This is from a survey of employees who are self-reporting what they find valuable or not. The 4% could be any number of things. It could be people who misunderstood the question, could be people who, like some other flaw in the collection method. To your point, it could be people for whom feedback has been a punitive thing, right? The only feedback they ever get is that they're failing to meet expectations, and it usually is preceded by a conversation of termination. So those are good reasons to fear feedback, as you would fear anything that has only ever been used in a painful way, in a difficult way. But I don't think there's any statistical statement to make about that 4%. It's an interesting question, though.
Excellent. But on the flip side, the 96%, why do you think that is? For me personally, I think it's just an opportunity for growth, but curious to learn more about your perspective.
Well, I think that the reason I presented it as being potentially intuitive to the point of being obvious is that, we're social creatures, first of all. Humans like interaction and contact with other humans. So that's been proven in lots of places. When you're in a work setting, though, regardless of what you do, if you are a baker, if you are a software developer, if you are, whatever you are, a trainer, there's someone who is providing a vision of what good looks like. And you're every day sort of taking action in pursuit of that vision. What feedback does is tells you how well you're doing. So when I hear that 96% of employees in this research study say that feedback is a positive thing, of course they do. They're not the ones that are sort of crafting the shareholder value. They're not the ones that are crafting the global vision if they work for a global company. So without feedback, it's hard to know whether what you're doing matters in the context of the organization. So yeah, so again, I think it's intuitive because it's so critical to a work setting that I think it's a given that it comes that way. That said, I also don't think it's done consistently. I saw some of that in the research, and I don't think it's necessarily done well in all cases either.
Excellent. And then following up on the research, the other statistics that you shared with us, I believe it was it 48%?
48% say that they're currently getting the right amount. So a little less than half in a different study say that, yep, they're getting about the right amount of feedback. There's some interesting things in that number, right? So first of all, fewer than half of the folks, I think I want to say it was more than 5,000 respondents to this particular survey. Fewer than half say that they're getting the right amount of feedback. So that has its own level of concerning. But what's interesting there too is what is the right level of feedback? Is going to vary from individual to individual. We have different needs as individuals, and so even if the same amount were applied evenly across all those respondents, and of course it's not, it's interesting to know how those respondents interpret right amount or wrong amount.
That's an interesting perspective with the amount of feedback, because yes, it would be different in different roles and industries and type of work that people do.
Yep.
But at the same time, I also learned that very simple feedback, like when I learned to give feedback, the simple idea of just saying "great job," it just doesn't do the trick, because I've learned the more specific, the more terrific.
Oh, well said. Yeah, and the other thing, and so I actually have created an online course around giving feedback, and I think that when we think about like feedback given, 48% say that they're getting enough feedback. There's a quality of feedback point to the point that you just made, right? So good job is perhaps not as useful, although I would argue that good job is more useful than nothing. So if you're looking at like how to engage, I've seen leaders sort of assume, well, she knows she did a good job, she doesn't need me to tell her, right? So I've heard that argument from leaders. So I think that there are, for me, 3 categories of feedback that end up being useful for anybody. One is positive reinforcement. And we could do our entire conversation today on positive reinforcement. There is so much good research that indicates that if you want to influence behavior, as leaders we do, the most consistent and effective way to influence behavior is with positive reinforcement. Hey, Jessper, the point you brought up in that meeting was exactly what we needed to hear in that moment. Thank you very much. Specific, timely, targeted, right? Positive reinforcement, you are much more likely to bring points like that one forward in a meeting in the future. The second one is course correction. And this is where I think a lot of leaders miss as well, which is, hey, Jessper, that point you made in the meeting, it was close, but you actually missed an important component. So I want you to work on that for next time. It's not heavy. It's not dramatic. Doesn't have to be. It's just a quick, like, we're going this way and I kind of need you going that way. And then the third one, of course, is having real performance conversations when performance matters. And I think we get more practice at that, but it's problematic as well. So the feedback that ends up being motivational, right? We talked about feedback for motivation. It's positive reinforcement, reinforce the behavior you want to see repeated, and it's course correction. Make slight corrections when you know the person on your team needs to move a slightly different way.
I love those insights. And I'd love to take a deeper dive into feedback. And I'd like to know your story of what inspired you to really jump into understanding the power of feedback.
This is a great question. So a long time ago, I've done some interesting things in my career. I have a master's degree in psychology, and I worked in mental health settings many, many years ago. And I worked with a brilliant psychologist who helped me understand that when we worked in a psychiatric hospital with children, so children ages 4 to 12. And when she was trying to influence the behavior of a group of children, say 10 children at a time, she would say things like, I appreciate that Greg is standing still and waiting for directions right now. I appreciate that Jessper is keeping his hands in his pockets and focusing on what I'm doing right now. So what she's doing in that example, I was fascinated by it. She is making statements about the people who are, children in this case, who are exhibiting the right behavior as a way of influencing those who are not exhibiting the right behavior. So I asked her a lot of questions about that at the time after the fact, and learned the point that I made a moment ago about the impact of positive reinforcement. So that got me down a path that I moved later into corporate roles and as a leader in corporate roles, kept me on the path of researching the impacts of positive reinforcement and how easy it is to use little bits of that to influence behavior. So it came from those early experiences in working with children in this case, in a mental health and a clinical setting.
Interesting. And I'd
Yeah.
also love to know, when it comes to feedback, why should leaders pay much more attention to the power of how they give, receive, and really understand this idea of feedback?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the why is that there's a specific measurable return. So back to my earlier point about if I'm a leader, or even if I'm not a leader, if I work within an organization, somebody else has created the vision. Somebody else has decided who we're going to be as an organization. Maybe if I'm a CEO or the chairman of the board of an organization, that's different. But in most cases, all cases in my career, I have been taking action in pursuit of someone else's vision. It's great. We all do it. The little bits of feedback that I get as an employee in those moments are what allows me to know that my work is contributing to that overall vision, contributing to those results, right? So if I'm a leader, your question, what's the value in giving that feedback? Getting the results that you want. Let's make it simple. If you're a sales leader and there are specific actions that you know that you need from your sales people, if you provide the littlest bit of positive reinforcement to keep them focused on the behaviors that you know are going to result in sales, you're going to get more sales. So the revenue is going to come in, you're going to close the deals, all because you're giving those little bits of feedback. So there's a return on that investment. It's also fun and easy.
And when it comes to feedback, I was curious to learn more about timing. How consistently and frequently should leaders have these conversations?
It's a great question. So, and kind of back to the earlier point about, 48% say that they're getting about the right amount of feedback, and then there's a large chunk that's getting too little and a large chunk that's getting too much. So it's not right to say just feedback constantly, a constant rush of feedback. It's not useful. So from a frequency perspective, I would say that's a great question. I would say a leader should expect, this is different for different levels. If I'm a senior level leader and the people in my team are senior level, once every couple of weeks for a quick bit of positive reinforcement, probably plenty. If I'm in a more frontline role, daily might not be overdone. Now that said, don't make it up. It's got to be real, right? It's got to be, hey, there's a thing that you did. You're pointing to an inflection point. You made a choice. You did a thing, and I want to acknowledge it and recognize you for it. The other is it's got to be real. It's got to be believable. If you haven't worked for the kind of leader that is sort of a constant fountain of vaguely positive platitudes, then good for you, because that's its own weird kind of annoying feedback. It's not useful. It's not actionable. And then to your point, and you mentioned this yourself earlier, and you're exactly right, as close as possible to the point of action, right? If, Jessper, you're on my team and I recognize something that you've done that I want to reinforce, but I don't mention it for a month, you're not going to remember it. You're not going to be in the moment for it. So as close as possible, as close as reasonable to the point of action, I want to give that feedback.
Excellent. And when it comes to performance management, even all-star teams, not everyone has a perfect, well-oiled machine 24/7. But when it comes to a team member who is not putting in their best effort at that moment, how should we approach those conversations into really bringing them back on track?
That's also a good question. I would not ever say, certainly as an opening, I would never say to a member of my team that they weren't putting in their best effort. It's not up to me to judge their effort. It's also not up to me to judge their priorities. And I'll talk about that in a minute. What I would say is, I didn't get what I expected for this deliverable from your performance. So that's my opening usually is I didn't get what I expected. I expected one thing, I got something else, because the first thing I want to do is ask questions. What's happening, right? What's going on? There could be a misunderstanding. Oh, I thought that this thing was really low priority, and so I've not been treating well. Oh, okay, great. Let's align on our understanding of priorities. Or you're right, and maybe they'll say it wasn't my best effort. There's been a death in my family recently, and I'm really finding myself sort of caught up with that. That's a reasonable conversation for why a deliverable was met or a performance bar wasn't met. But again, the first thing always is what I expected is not what I got. Can we have a conversation about that? So that's the first bit of feedback, right? If the conversation there is, I just didn't think that was that important, right? So now we're going to align on our expectations, and I'm going to say it is important. These are the reasons why. These are why that thing is critical, right? So now the feedback you're getting is course correction, right? I'm giving you information on what I need you to do to meet that expectation. Now, if I had that conversation, it's still not happening, we get to a conversation of, hey, Jessper, we've had this conversation a couple of times. We talked about the performance expectations in your role. You've been missing them consistently. You continue to miss them. So then it's either into what we're going to do now is talk about performance improvement plan. And there's a timeline at the end of it. You need to know that your job is in jeopardy. And this may be where we have to part ways, right? However I state that will have everything to do with where I am in the conversation. And I'll say to anybody who's paying attention, listening right now, if you get to that part of a conversation, you should have already engaged with your HR professionals, your HR partner, and or your legal partner. So terminating employment comes with a lot of moving parts. If you believe you're headed down that path, you get your HR partner in the conversation and or legal in the conversation. But what you also do is you give clear, unambiguous feedback. You are failing to meet the expectation for your role. I'm not going to say you're not putting forth your best effort. It's not for me to judge. I'm not going to say that your priorities are off. Also not for me to judge. What I will say is that we have a documented expectation and you're failing to meet it.
That's an excellent insight. And when it comes from your experience, Greg, I was curious to know I'd like to hear an experience where you've either given or received great feedback and what made it so great.
Yeah. That's a great question. I know I keep saying that, but it keeps being true. I got great feedback from a manager, let's say maybe 10 or 12 years ago. And so I was in a relatively senior role. And so I reported to a vice president in a software company. And I had only been in the company for maybe 6 weeks at this point. And she had given me kind of the places she wanted me to be, the meetings she wanted me to show up in. And there's, like the example I used earlier, there's one meeting that I had not gone to. At about the 6-week mark, I had not gone yet. I interpreted it as a lower value meeting. So I was doing a lot of other things. I'm like, yep, I'll get to that one. In her mind, it was a much higher value meeting. It was a critical meeting. I also concluded that she was right. So I was in a one-on-one with her, and all she said was, hey, today was that software release meeting, and you weren't there. I needed you there. So clear. She set her expectations, right? I needed you there. She clarified where I had missed her expectations. You weren't there. It needed no other information. I attended the next meeting. I got what she wanted. I understood what she wanted from me to be able to take that action. So that's an example of what I got. Course correction feedback that was just so useful in the moment. And again, it was quick, 2 sentences as part of a larger conversation. And then I'll also give this example. There's a video on my YouTube channel about mistakes I've made as a people leader. And I use this one there where I had an employee in my team many years ago who was failing to meet the bar in her role. And I was having regular conversations with her in our one-on-ones. What I was failing to do was be very clear, be, again, unambiguous, very clear about the fact that she was missing the bar for her role. I didn't say, your job is in jeopardy because you're failing to meet the expectations for your role, until I was about a month in. And at that point, this employee was like, what? My job is in jeopardy? And I thought, all this time, how have you not gotten that? Well, of course, she hadn't gotten that because I hadn't said it. So that's another example that was such a great lesson for me on how to have a clear, unambiguous message. And even though it's awkward, it's uncomfortable as heck to say, hey, you're missing the bar for this role and your job is in jeopardy. I didn't enjoy having that conversation. But we had a much more useful conversation after I said it clearly than we had up to that moment. So those are valuable. I could have done it better.
Such a valuable insight. And when it comes to giving feedback, what other things should leaders know when it comes to providing that, whether effective or ineffective feedback? But good to know.
A couple things leaders should know. One is you've got to know, you got to be able to express objectively what your expectations are. It can't be, I'll know it when I see it, right? And so you've got to be able to say to your team, here's what good looks like. By the way, here's what excellent looks like. So that when you have that course correction conversation, it won't be surprised. This other thing that I think you need to know will sound like it's in conflict with the point I just made, but it's not, which is I just lost my train of thought. So my first point was you've got to have clear expectations on what good looks like. And then I talked about unambiguous conversation. You've got to be able to say clearly and without hesitation what was good or what was missed when you're having that conversation.
Excellent.
Yeah.
That's a good insight.
Thanks.
And before we wrap up, for the people who want to learn more about the power of feedback and your research, what's the best way to reach you?
So my website is gregbrisendine.com. So I would say go to gregbrisendine.com. And in fact, I have an online course on giving feedback, and it is currently free on the website for about another week. So if you're listening to this and it is not yet the end of March 2025, then you've got about a week while that course is free. Even after that, it's not going to be very much money. But you can get access to the website. You can also get information there on the YouTube channel that I have and some of the information there, or just email me if you want to talk. Let's have a conversation.
Excellent. And before we go, a final piece of wisdom that you have for people who are watching.
Yeah. Final piece of wisdom. You're going to get it wrong. You're going to find yourself in a conversation where you believe you should have talked more earlier, where you believe you should have given more signs or given more clues. Whatever, let it go. You're going to get it wrong. You're going to make mistakes. You still need to lean in and be the leader that your team needs you to be. So get someone to support you. Your HR partner is a good choice. Your boss is a good choice, but get the support you need to look out for you when you have to admit that you could have done better and didn't. You still got to move forward.
Greg, that was powerful wisdom.
Thanks, Jessper.
But really enjoyed our conversation today.
I did too.
And for our guests out there, we really hope that you picked up some great insights. Please feel free to share this discussion with any other leaders who could benefit from our insights on the power of feedback. And last but not least, I want to thank everyone out there who's watching. Again, thank you, Greg, for joining me. Absolutely love today's conversation. And for everyone out there, again, thank you for tuning in. We'll see you in the next episode.
Bye, everyone. Thanks, Jessper.